Welcome to the online lecture for personality assessments. So we're going to overview personality, talk about objective measures, projective measures, and behavioral assessment broadly in these set of lectures. So again, we're looking at assessment, and whenever we're assessing anything, I want to remind you that there's a purpose to it. We're trying to predict future behavior. We're trying to make determinations and decisions, sometimes clinical decisions, sometimes organizational decisions, sometimes educational decisions, based on psychological measurement. So in this case, we're mainly looking at the psychological measurement of personality. And personality assessment kind of broadly can be broken down into a couple of fields of what we're using it for. First, we can use personality assessment to kind of determine what is a clinical norm of behavior. So basically, what behaviors, what personality traits are considered within the range of normal function in a particular culture. And it is somewhat culturally based, so different cultures have different expectations. Someone who's considered to be of average extroversion in the United States, for instance, might be seen as being overly extroverted in Japan. There's different cultural, basically, norms of behavior. But once you actually identify what are the culturally normed behaviors of personality, this also allows us to make clinical decisions of when various people may actually be outside of that range. So, personality disorders. And usually that's, again, a match of a particular personality trait that is outside of the range of normal behavior for that culture. We can also use personality assessments to help us make vocational and hiring choices based on kind of a person environment fit. That if we know that a particular company or a particular school has a large number or a kind of a personality profile, most of the people that work there or most of the people that go there fit this particular personality profile. Measuring people's personality would let us have a pretty good idea of predicting how well they'd fit in that environment. So, for instance, when I actually take personality assessments, one of the things that often comes out in assessments of my personality is that I'm fairly directive. So I tend to take charge, and I also am not the best person at working in groups. So there has been a couple of jobs that I've applied for that I have not been selected for based on a personality assessment, and that personality assessment told them this person is great working by themselves, great getting projects done, and great in leadership positions, but maybe not so much working in a collaborative team. And unfortunately, the job that we're hiring for, that's what this person would be doing, is they would be working primarily with collaborative teams. And that's probably a fair assessment. I probably, though I could do the job, I probably wouldn't enjoy it as well, and that also means it's less likely that I would then stay with that job, that I'd have my job satisfaction. So that's primarily what we're talking about when we're talking about personality assessment. Ways to kind of determine either whether someone is functioning within the norms of that society or whether someone would be a very good fit for a particular role based on their personality. So, personality and personality assessment. Personality, the definition, an individual's unique constellation of psychological traits that's relatively stable over time. So, that's a couple of important things there. The first idea is that we have an assumption that personality is relatively stable. That means that the person's traits, these individual unique psychological traits, are fairly stable over a long period of time. Now, that does not mean that personality is a perfect predictor of behavior. A very extroverted person, someone that's very talkative, very kind of in your face, is still probably going to be fairly quiet when they're at a church or when they're in a lecture. So personality often is a function of both the personality and the situation. So again, take someone that's very introverted and put them into a party situation. They'll probably be more extroverted than they normally would be. But they would still be much less extroverted than someone that is normally very extroverted anyway, who would therefore thrive in that situation. So, personality traits are any distinguishable, relatively enduring way in which one individual varies from another. So, basically, any personality trait is simply an accepted construct that people can differ on. So, we can differ, for example, on friendliness. We can differ on how agreeable we are. We can differ on how open we are to new experiences. And those are examples of personality traits, clusters of behaviors that basically kind of indicate an overall worldview or the way someone frames how they view the world. And then finally, we have personality type. the personality type is when we have a particular pattern of traits. So personality is all of the traits. Personality traits are individual distinguishable traits that we can kind of measure separately and differentiate people from each other on. So, for example, in the Big Five, agreeableness. People vary on how agreeable or not agreeable they are in general. And a personality type is a combination of those traits that basically creates a pattern that allows us to identify a category of personality from basically a taxonomy of personality. So a taxonomy just means a combination. So for instance, someone that is very high in conscientiousness and also very high in agreeableness and very low in neuroticism would be a very friendly, very detail oriented, and fairly emotionally stable person. That would be a cluster of traits that's telling us about that type of person. And a lot of times when we're looking at personality and vocational psychology, that's one of the things we're looking for. Is that a lot of times there will be an understanding of this is the particular personality type, a constellation of traits of the type of person that does very well in this company. And that's who we want to hire for, people that match that pattern or that constellation. So personality assessment is the measure of personality, and there's different forms of ways that we can do this. One way is assessees may respond to interview questions or answers on a questionnaire or even on a computer. Some forms of personality assessment rely on actually information outside of the person. So we can both measure personality directly through self-report. We can also measure personality by having other report. So having parents, for example, rate the personality of students, have parents rate the personality of their children, teachers rate the personality of their students, or even having your friends fill out forms. And what's interesting is that when we actually use self-assessment and these other assessment techniques, we often find that we get a little bit of a difference. The self-assessments are often a little bit closer to what we wish that we were, while other assessments often are a little bit closer about how we actually behave. So for instance, my own self-assessment of extroversion, I am average. In other words, if you look at the spectrum between introversion and extroversion, when I take a self-assessment, I would actually put myself right in the middle. I'm basically, in my opinion, about equally introverted and extroverted. However, if you ask my students, my peers, my friends, my partner, my fellow instructors, most of them would probably rate me as higher on extroversion because my job requires me to be extroverted. I have to be outgoing, I have to be doing lectures, I have to be talking in front of large groups of people. So that kind of gives you an idea that though internally I may not feel that extroverted, the way I behave is extroverted. Some methods of personality assessment also rely on the assessee's own self-report. When we're using a pure self-report measure, so a measure that is only asking the assessee to talk about their own personality, one of the things we'll often include in that assessment is what's called a validity scale. So remember, validity is just a word meaning truthfulness. So this is a subscale of questions that are built into the assessment that are designed to assess whether the person is actually answering honestly. So if, for example, if I'm taking a personality assessment for a job that I know involves a lot of group work and group collaboration, I could try to change the answers that I would give normally about items that are about how well I work with groups. The idea behind this, though, is it's hard to maintain inaccurate responses over a large series of questions, and a lot of times we can actually design questions that determine if the test taker is actually either responding carelessly, trying to be deceptive, or misunderstanding the questions. So a validity scale often is just additional questions that are actually calculated. It's not a measure of personality. It's an indicator of how accurate is that personality assessment. And these are often very useful, especially if we're trying to make clinical decisions based on a personality assessment. Because a lot of times these self-assessments, it's pretty clear what's being measured. If you get a question that asks you, I like to have everything in its place, and I like everything has a place that needs to be put up. Those are questions that clearly are measuring conscientiousness. And most people would recognize it's like, wow, if I answer no, I don't like to put things up, it basically says I'm kind of cluttered. If I say yes, it means I'm kind of orderly. If you're taking a job that requires orderly behavior, which one are you going to respond? You're probably going to respond that you are orderly because you know it's being used to determine if you get the job or not. That's why these validity scales are often pretty important in these kind of tests. So, origins of personality testing. So, the idea of assessing individual differences is much older than psychology or psychiatry. It's the questions of, what makes us special, what makes us different, but also how stable and predictable is behavior based on these differences. There are hundreds of tests and many theories that look at personality, but one of the broad findings is that yes, personality is fairly stable. However, personality alone is not a great predictor of behavior. You need to know the personality and the situation. It's a personality interaction between personality and situation that determines behavior. So if someone is very conscientious, but they're late for a flight, they're probably going to be much less likely to clean up a mess. While someone that actually is not very conscientious, but basically knows they're going to be fired if they don't clean up their desk, very much likely would clean up their desk. So again, the personality trait, high conscientiousness, we'd be surprised by someone leaving a mess when they're in a hurry. And someone with low conscientiousness would be surprised when their desk is cleaned up when there's a threat of firing. But those are both examples of how the situation kind of trumped personality. So we're going to talk about some of the broad theories of personality testing. Our first one is psychoanalytic theory. So in the Victorian era, so mid-1800s, Freud started treating hysteria, and based on his meeting with various people basically suffering from various anxiety disorders, he started to create his theory of subconscious motivated behavior. The idea that the personality of a person that we know, our conscious personality, is often being influenced by unknown factors, the subconscious. So, based on this idea, this theory that personality is primarily being driven by unconscious drives, unconscious thoughts, the initial measures of personality were ones that used projective tests. These are examples: pictures interpretations, word associations, and the infamous inkblot test of Rorschach. And the idea behind this is that if personality is truly coming from a subconscious way, the only way to really measure it is to provide an opportunity for your subconscious to interpret ambiguous figures. And we're going to come back to these projective tests later. But it is important to note that they were basically the first systematic way to try to measure personality, based on Freud's early theories of personality. So one of the next earliest theories of personality is we get basically type theories. So basically the idea of trying to group people into broad categories. And probably one of the most famous of these type theories is type A versus type B. So type A personalities tend to achieve more in less time, but also tend to be fairly aggressive, fairly extroverted, and actually fairly stressed as well. Generally speaking, when I take a type theory of personality, type A versus type B, I myself come out fairly type A. Type B people are more easygoing, relaxed, and non-competitive. So they're more generally less likely to achieve in a given time period. That doesn't mean that they don't get things done, but they tend to get things done in a more slow and relaxed atmosphere. They usually work better in groups. They also tend to be less stressed. And actually, this initial theory, and we'll talk about it again a little bit as we talk about each theory in detail, was also had a major physiological component. That type A personalities were also more likely to have physiological distress, heart problems, breathing problems, etc., compared to type B. Our next broad area of personality theory is phenomenological theories. So these come from a general thought of that people tend to be aspirational. So introspective approach is basically just asking people to reflect on their own personality. So what traits make you different? What unique combination of personality traits do you have that would allow you to do better in your life? How can you basically tap into your strengths? Rogers' Q technique, currently called the Q-sort technique, was another example of this, and it was again based on this idea that people tend to be striving to be better. There is a drive for people to be more creative, to be more actualized. That basically people want to live good lives. So Rogers was a positive psychologist, and his Q-sort technique was basically you were given a large pile of basically personality traits, and you had to sort them based on yourself, So which traits are most representational of you, which are the least representational of you, which are average of you. But after you did that, you would also then do an ideal sort. So according to you, what would be the best aspirational personality for someone to have? And then the idea behind this is that you look at the difference between your self sort and your actual ideal sort and ask yourselves, how can I move forward towards this more ideal personality that I would want to attain? We also have behavioral and social learning theories of personality. So Rotter's 1966 came up with the idea of locus of control. And again, this is an individual personality trait that differentiates people. In other words, this is something, it's a psychological construct. It's a personality trait that allows us to make discriminations between people. And according to Rotter's, basically everyone varied from a very high internal locus of control to a very high external. And this is the continuum, so you can move anywhere from being completely internal all the way to being completely external. Most people would fall somewhere in the range between these two bipolar ends. So, internal locus of control is basically people that believe that they are in control of their own behaviors and the consequences. And generally, we find people with internal locus of control. Think of this as being very individualistic and pretty much owning your decisions and your behaviors. And people with high internal locus control are associated with better interpersonal relationships, so they take responsibility for what they do in interpersonal relationships, tend to do better in academic achievement, so they believe that they're responsible for how well they do or don't do in classes, tend to have a greater effort to learn, tend to have positive attitudes towards exercise, less cigarette smoking, and also lower hypertension and heart attacks. So basically, this is someone that basically goes through life saying, I can control what I do and I can take responsibility for my behaviors. Someone with a high external locus of control believes the consequences of their behavior are outside of their control. More resigned to conditions as they are, less effort to deal with health, less effort to psychologically adjust. But generally, this is also in non responsive environments. So basically, the quote unquote negatives of an external locus of control is that you are in an environment that isn't giving you cues. So if you're in a very structured environment that tells you this is how you're supposed to behave, this is how you're supposed to do, you very well may still thrive. It's the fact that you accept that it's outside forces that determine your behaviors. Similarly to Rotter's scale, we have Bandura's self-efficacy, and again, this is a single trait theory of personality, but it basically says that one of the big predictors of how well someone does in their life is defined by one particular personality construct or trait, and that is self-efficacy. Your confidence of whether or not you can achieve tasks. So if someone tells you you need to learn a new language, this is a brand new task, it's something you've never done before. If you have high self-efficacy, you would be sitting there thinking, well, it's going to be hard. I haven't ever learned a second language, but you know what? If I take the time and get the proper materials and I work hard at it, I'm sure I can do it. That's someone that has a high self-efficacy. I have confidence that given the right resources, the right support, and the right amount of time, I can achieve a task. Someone with low self-efficacy would be like, that's impossible. There's just no way I can do it. I don't see how I can do it. And again, you can kind of determine that those two attitudes are going to be a pretty big predictor of success in the behavior. So as we move forward with the origins of personality, we start to get to the first theories that start to really define beyond just but basically two-level traits. So we talked about, for example, locus of control, either internal or external. Bandura's self-efficacy, you're either high or you're low. We talked about type A versus type B. As we move forward, we start to get to the trait theories, and these are theories that try to come up with a cluster of traits that are all useful in predicting behavior dependent on the situation. So trait conceptions measure individual differences, and the big difference in these theories is how many individual traits they're trying to measure. So one of our first ones is Cattell's factor and analytic trait theory, the 16PF. Basically, the idea behind this is that there was, according to Cattell, there's 16 individual traits of personality that are important in predicting people's behavior and function and success. He also broke these further up to surface versus source traits. So there was like a smaller number of core source traits, that were kind of more of the internal personality that then resulted in a greater number of surface traits, more observable behavior. We have Eysenck's trait dimensional theory, basically the idea that you have introversion versus extroversion and then emotional stability versus neuroticism. So Eysenck's theory was basically a two-factor theory, but each factor had two different kind of traits associated with it. So introverted versus extroverted, stable versus neurotic. And moving forward to the theory that most of us are more familiar with, the five-factor model, Big Five, included some of Eysenck's traits. We've got neuroticism, which varies from being very emotionally stable to very neurotic. We have extroversion, which is very extroverted to very introverted, but also openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And if we looked at Cattell's 16-factor theory, we'd see similar traits in his theory as well. All of these theories basically have some support for them. The argument is how much do you need to break down personality into how many individual traits? Most of the actual statistical research has indicated that the five-factor model is probably one of the most supported. That yes, you can break down factors of personality into more than five factors, but as you do that, you kind of start to get to those surface traits that Cattell talked about. They're just sub-traits of these bigger source traits. So the five-factor model doesn't think of neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness as quote-unquote source traits like Cattell's theory, but that's basically what they are. They're definitely accepting that, like conscientiousness can be broken down into how conscientious you are in your work behaviors, how conscientious you are in your treatment of others, how conscientious you are with your personal hygiene, your dress, and even your living space. But all of those are kind of individual packages of behaviors that overall are often indicating a general level of conscientiousness. As I also said, another way we can look at personality beyond the theories is how we want to measure it. So objective measures are typically administered by paper and pencil or computer and are often short answer items that the assessee is tasked to select one response from those provided. So very direct measurement. Do you want to do A, B, or C? Do you think of yourself as very conscientious or not? While projective measures are still going back to those original theories of Freud, this idea that a part of the process when we're looking at personality is we're trying to tap into some subconscious or unknown factors of personality. So in the projective measures, individuals supply structure to an unstructured stimuli in a manner consistent with their own pattern of personality. It's an indirect measure of personality. So when given an ambiguous image, what does someone see? And then based on that, we start to try to indirectly infer what their personality is like. So theory-guided objective tests, state and trait anxiety inventories. One of the things we want to talk about when we do an objective test, so these are direct measures of personality, is we do want to make sure that we're measuring trait or state. So state anxiety is a temporary condition, and you can ask questions about how anxious are you right now? How anxious are you in a particular situation? That would be state anxiety. Trait anxiety is more about the personality. So everyone experiences anxiety, state anxiety occasionally, regardless of their trait anxiety. But someone that has high trait anxiety is more likely to experience frequent state anxiety. And someone with low trait anxiety, a permanent, stable personality trait, would be less likely to experience state anxiety on a moment-to-moment kind of basis. Another way we can actually do objective measuring is an example of Edwards' personality preference schedule. It uses dyads, so you have to basically pick from a pair of similar statements. So one example is, I feel sad when I watch a tragic news story. I feel nervous speaking in front of a group. Notice that both of these are about a bit of anxiety, feeling sad with a tragic news story or feeling nervous in front of a group. And these are ipsitative questions. Basically, the idea here is that neither of these questions are, I'm not anxious. Both of them are degrees of anxiousness. And this is another way to try to actually use a direct test of personality that keeps people from trying to cheat the system or come up with only pro-social or socially desirable answers. The last kind of personality test that I want to talk about in this particular module is a theory-guided objective test, and this is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's a forced choice format, self-report. So you get a series of questions. Each one you have to choose either or questions. So you're given a whole series of which would you rather do kind of questions. It's based on Carl Jung's theory of personality and his belief that basically, theoretically speaking, the personality can be divided into four broad categories: extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, judging versus perceiving. So, based on this, we have basically these four traits, but then we also have personality profiles based on whether you scored high or low on each one of these. So let's take a quick look at how this actually works. So here's the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and they're based on these four traits which have a high or low in each. You basically have a total of 16 possible personality profiles. Towards the top is people that tend to focus on what the future and the possibility. Towards the bottom are people that tend to focus on the present. Towards the right are people that tend to be more logical, and people to the left tend to be more personal and emotional. So, for example, an ENTJ, which is the top right, is actually what I come out on in the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And this is called the field marshal. So basically, I'm an E, an N, and a T, and a J. So I'm generally extroverted. I tend to be high in intuition. I tend to be very much on thinking over feeling. And I tend to be more judgmental than perceiving. So I tend to try to make judgments. I try to make decisions. So that's my personality. And again, this is the idea of trying to find a personality profile that you can then match to the environment that person would be well suited for. So notice that a teacher, for instance, would be an ENFJ. Capable of making judgments, fairly extroverted, fairly intuitive, but also somewhat feeling and compassionate. Look at the bottom, right bottom. We have ESTJ, a supervisor. So someone that's very thinking and judgmental, but also sensing. In other words, they're willing to kind of think outside the box a little bit, but also still extroverted. So anyway, this is another example, and we're going to talk about more examples in the following modules of various types of personalities. But this is one of our first modern theories that we still use today. A lot of companies use the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's used a lot in vocational psychology, so kind of giving people an idea of here's what your personality profile looks like, and here's the kind of jobs that this kind of personality profile would work well with. And again, theory-guided objective tests. We already talked about type A versus type B behavior. And again, this was actually created by cardiologists Meyer Friedman and Ray Roseman. And the idea here is to find what personality traits were more likely to actually experience heart disease. And what they found is they were able to determine two broad types of personality profiles. Type A personality, competitive, haste, restlessness, impatient, feeling of being time pressured, a strong need for achievement and dominance, versus the type B, completely opposite, mellow and laid back. There's currently the Jenkins Activity Survey that's often used to measure type A versus type B. It's 52 items, multiple choice, and self-report. And again, this is not a bad measure of, one, it does predict health outcomes, and it also isn't a bad measure for predicting fit for organizations. So if you have an organization that is very time pressured, very much about achieving and making sure that you are being very competitive, you probably want to hire a lot of type A personalities. If you're a company that's more focused on getting along, working in groups, you probably want a lot more type B personalities in that company.